There are moments in history so sharp, so deliberate, so cruelly public, that they do not simply happen, they are performed. They're staged for an audience. They're designed to break something inside a person while everyone watches, to make the breaking feel like justice. This was one of those moments. The Cathedral Hall of Ashenvale had stood for 400 years. Its arched stone ceilings rose so high that torchlight barely reached them, flickering instead along the carved pillars where the faces of old kings stared down in permanent silence. The floor was pale granite, worn smooth by centuries of boots, by warriors who had knelt there and been crowned there and been buried from there. The windows were narrow and tall, and on this particular evening, the dying light of the sun came through them in long, cold slants, the kind of light that feels like a warning. Every seat in the hall was filled. They had come from every corner of the kingdom, lords and soldiers and merchants and servants. They had dressed in their best, because a public exile was not just a judgment, it was a spectacle. They had come the way people always come to watch someone else fall, with relief that it is not them, and with hunger that they would never admit. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a throne carved from black iron and dark stone, sat Donald. He was not a large man in the way soldiers are large. He was lean, deliberate, armored in blackened steel that caught no light, because it was built that way to absorb it, to give nothing back. He held a staff across his knees with one gloved hand, not because he needed it to stand, but because power, for men like Donald, requires props. He wore authority the way lesser men wear jewelry. His face was still. His eyes were not. His eyes were sharp, and they were already moving toward the center of the hall, toward Alma. She stood alone in the middle of the open floor, and the space around her felt immense, not because the hall was empty, but because every person in it had moved back, inch by inch, as though proximity to her verdict might somehow stain them. She wore a gown of deep violet, the fabric catching the torchlight and returning it in soft, shimmering waves, the kind of gown people in this kingdom had always called too gentle, too decorative, too feminine for a woman who wanted to be taken seriously. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders in loose waves that moved slightly with each breath, as though even the air around her refused to stay still. Her expression was calm, not the calm of someone who is not afraid, the calm of someone who has decided that whatever comes next, they will not give this room the satisfaction of watching them break. She was 23 years old, and if you had looked closely, if you had watched her instead of watching Donald, you might have seen it. Something behind her eyes that was older than her face. Something patient. Something waiting. The hall was not silent. It buzzed with whispers, with the low grinding sound of bodies shifting on stone benches, with the occasional muffled laugh from the section where Troy sat Troy, who had the particular talent of people who mistake cruelty for wit. He sat in the first tier of the council seats, dressed in deep burgundy, his posture open and relaxed in the way of a man who has already decided how this evening ends. Beside him, Sandra sat straight and still, her arms folded across her chest, her expression arranged into something between boredom and contempt. She did not laugh. She never laughed at moments like this. She simply watched, and her watching was somehow worse. Farther along the wall, near one of the stone pillars where the torchlight was weakest, stood Ralph. He was dressed in muted armor, the kind that does not announce itself, and he stood separate from the crowd the way he always stood, slightly apart, arms at his sides, completely still. He was watching Alma with the focused, unreadable attention of a man who has already made a calculation that nobody else in the room has thought to make. He felt it before he could name it. Something about this moment was wrong. Not politically wrong. Not morally wrong, though it was that too. Something deeper. Something the way you feel standing outside before a storm when the air goes very quiet and the birds stop and your whole body knows before your mind does that what is coming is not ordinary. Ralph's jaw tightened. Donald rose from the throne. The room went silent so fast it felt physical, like a door slamming. "The matter before this council," Donald said, his voice carrying the particular quality of men who have spent decades ensuring their voice carries, "is not a complicated one. The kingdom of Ashenvale has survived 4 centuries because it has understood one truth above all others. Strength is not merely valued here. It is required. It is the currency of survival, the language of governance, the measure of every citizen's worth. He paused. An Alma of the House of Caldwell has spent 23 years demonstrating that she does not possess it. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not quite agreement, not quite discomfort. Something in between the sound an audience makes when it has already decided to be entertained. Troy made a sound that was almost a laugh. Sandra did not move. Ralph did not look away from Alma. And Alma lifted her chin exactly 1 inch. Not defiance. Not yet. Something quieter. A woman deciding, in real time, what kind of person she's going to be when this is over. Nobody in that hall understood what was sleeping inside her. Nobody except, perhaps, the ancient walls themselves. And whatever it was, it had just heard its name called. Call to action. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if something in that opening just moves something in you, I want you to know that feeling is the whole point. Alma's story is only beginning, and where it goes next is going to surprise you. Thank you so much for being here. It genuinely means everything. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us. Smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. All right, thank you. Now, let's get back to Alma. Here is what the kingdom believed about weakness. That it was inherited, that it was permanent, that it announced itself quietly, in small ways, long before any official verdict was ever handed down, in the softness of a voice, in the tendency to listen rather than command, in the unforgivable habit of asking how someone else was feeling before deciding what you wanted from them. By Ashenvale's standards, Alma had been announcing her weakness her entire life. She had grown up in the outer estates, not the impoverished districts, not the slums, but the kind of comfortable but not powerful neighborhood that exists in every rigid society. The place where people have enough to survive and not quite enough to matter. Her father had been a healer. Her mother had been a teacher. 2 professions that Ashenvale's ruling class tolerated the way you tolerate furniture. Useful, necessary, invisible. You don't put furniture on the throne. Alma had spent her childhood watching people like Donald decide what kind of strength counted and what kind didn't. She had watched her father heal wounded soldiers who returned from border skirmishes and were then discarded by the same commanders who had sent them. She had watched her mother teach children who were then graded not on what they understood, but on how loudly they could repeat what they were told. She had grown up understanding at the bone level that the kingdom's definition of strength was not about capability at all. It was about compliance, about being the kind of powerful that Donald and men like him could predict and control. She had refused to be that. And so, at 23, she stood in the cathedral hall and listened to Donald outline the case against her existence with the calm, procedural efficiency of a man filing paperwork. She has refused every military commission offered to her rank, Donald continued, reading from a document that one of his scribes held open before him. She has publicly questioned 3 separate council decrees. She has organized civilian aid networks in the outer districts without authorization. She has on multiple occasions demonstrated a pattern of behavior that this council has determined to be, he paused, as though enjoying the word before he said it, destabilizing. Destabilizing, Alma repeated quietly. The word carried. The hall went a shade quieter. She speaks without being addressed, Troy announced from the council's seats, leaning forward with a grin that had never once required effort. Charming. Truly. Someone should write it down for posterity, the last words of Ashenvale's most spectacularly unqualified citizen. Light laughter rippled across the upper tiers. The kind of laughter people produce not because something is genuinely funny, but because a person with power has signaled that they should. Sandra, for her part, simply watched Alma with the cold, assessing the expression of someone calculating not whether a thing will fall, but exactly how far the drop is. You organized civilian networks, Sandra said, cutting through Troy's theater with the precision of someone who has never needed an audience to feel powerful. You fed and sheltered citizens who the council had assessed as unproductive. You allocated resources that were not yours to allocate. You did this not once but repeatedly, and you did it without asking anyone's permission. I did, Alma said, and you see nothing wrong with that. I see everything right with it, Alma said. The people I helped were not unproductive. They were sick or injured or caring for children or recovering from the kind of disasters that your council keeps classifying as their personal failures instead of systemic ones. I helped them because they needed help and I was able to give it. I did not ask permission because the permission process in this kingdom is designed specifically to ensure that help never reaches the people who need it most. The hall had gone completely still. Not the polite stillness of an audience waiting for the next act. The electric, hell-breath stillness of people who have just heard something said out loud that they have been thinking privately for years and were not certain anyone else had noticed. Donald's eyes moved over the crowd. He saw it. He understood it immediately, and it made his voice colder when he spoke again. The verdict of this council, he said, is as follows. Alma of the House of Caldwell is hereby stripped of her civilian standing within the kingdom of Ashenvale. Her property is forfeit. Her networks are disbanded. And as this council cannot permit a citizen of destabilizing influence to remain within the capital, she is sentenced to the arena trial's 3 rounds of combat before the full court, after which, should she somehow survive, she will face permanent exile from Ashenvale's borders. The crowd exhaled, not in protest, in something worse, relief. Relief that it was not them. Relief that the system was working the way the system was supposed to work. Relief that was the most dangerous thing in the room, because it was the thing that made all of it possible. Alma looked at Donald for a long moment, and then she looked at the crowd, and what she felt was not fear. It was grief, brief and real, for every person in that hall who had chosen the comfort of obedience over the difficulty of conscience. She had known people like this her whole life. She understood them, even now. Understanding them had never once made their choices acceptable, but it had kept her from becoming what they accused her of being. Someone who looked at people she didn't agree with and saw enemies instead of human beings who had simply made different cowardly choices. That was the thing about Alma that nobody in that hall could name, but everyone felt, the way you feel a source of heat without being able to see the flame. She was not afraid of them. She was disappointed, and that was somehow, for Donald, far more unsettling. Brad appeared from the side corridor, the executioner, heavy-shouldered and armor-plated, his sword strapped across his back and a scabbard worn smooth from years of casual violence. He had the expression of a man who has been doing a job for so long that the job has become the whole of his personality. He looked at Alma the way a craftsman looks at a workpiece, assessing, bored, already measuring where the seams will break. 3 days, Donald said, standing from the throne. The first arena trial begins in 3 days. He did not look at Alma again. He had already lost interest in her, the way men like Donald lose interest in things the moment they believe they have already won. Nobody noticed that Ralph had moved. He was no longer by the pillar. He was now 3 steps closer to the center of the hall, which for Ralph was essentially a declaration of intent. His eyes never left Alma's face. There was something in his expression that was not quite protectiveness, not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two, the look of a man who has just seen a piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. The guards moved to escort Alma to the holding chambers. She walked with them without resistance, and as she passed through the great stone doorway, she turned her head slightly not toward the council, not toward Donald, but toward the narrow window on the eastern wall where the last of the evening light was coming through in a long, fading line of gold. She looked at it the way you look at something you're not ready to say goodbye to. Then she was gone. Lesson: systems that define strength only by dominance will always perceive empathy as a threat. History has taught us this pattern repeatedly, from civil rights movements to workplace equity battles. The most dangerous citizens to any corrupt power are not the violent ones. They're the ones who are awake. The holding chambers beneath the cathedral hall were not designed to be comfortable. They were designed to make a person feel the full weight of what had just happened to them. Cold stone walls, a single lamp that burned low and orange, and a silence so complete you could hear your own pulse. Alma sat on the narrow stone bench and counted her heartbeats. Not because she was afraid, because it was something to do with her hands while her mind worked through the math of her situation with the same methodical calm she had applied to everything in her life: the aid networks she had organized, the supply routes she had mapped, the carefully worded letters of appeal she had sent to council members who had filed them away without response. She had always been a planner. Right now, the plan was looking stark. 3 arena trials against opponents chosen by Brad, which meant chosen by Donald, because Brad had not made an independent decision in a decade. She had no weapons training. She had no armor. She had, by the kingdom's own accounting, nothing. What she had was this. She had spent 23 years watching how people moved, how systems failed, where the gaps were, what people overlooked when they thought they already knew the answer. She had spent 23 years being underestimated. That, she thought, might be the most useful thing she owned. The sound was so quiet she almost missed it. A soft scrape of boots on stone outside the chamber door. The specific sound of someone who knows how to move without being heard, but who has made the deliberate choice to be heard just slightly, just enough. Alma did not move. "You can come in," she said, "or you can keep standing outside, pretending you happen to be in this corridor for an unrelated reason." A pause. Then the door opened. Ralph stepped inside. Up close, he was quieter than he had seemed from across the hall. The muted armor, the careful posture, the eyes dark and measuring that moved over the room before they settled on her. Not threat assessment. Something else. More like the way a careful person reads a room they have been thinking about for a while. "You are not supposed to be here," Alma said. "No," he agreed. He did not seem troubled by this. "If you were sent by Donald." "I wasn't." She studied him. He met her gaze without flinching, which was notable because most people found sustained eye contact with Alma uncomfortable, not because she was aggressive, but because she had the particular quality of actually paying attention, which people who are used to being the one doing the assessing often find disarming. "Then what do you want?" she asked. "To tell you something," Ralph said. He pulled a small folded document from inside his armor and held it out. She took it. It was a transfer order, her name, an arena schedule, and a notation in the margin that was not in official script, but in a private shorthand she didn't recognize. That notation. It means your opponent for the first trial has already been selected. Brad didn't choose randomly. The selection was made the day before your verdict. Alma unfolded it. "Read it twice." "This verdict was decided before the tribunal," she said. "It was not a question." 3 weeks ago, Ralph said. The tribunal was the performance. The decision was made when Donald's financial auditors found that their aid networks in the outer districts had been documenting supply diversions that trace back to the Treasury. You weren't exiled for being weak. You were exiled because you were getting close to something Donald cannot afford to have in the open. The silence between them had a different quality now. Alma set the document down on the bench beside her. She was quiet for a moment, not processing. She had already processed. She processed fast, but arranging, setting things in order inside herself the way you rearrange a room before a long stay. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because," Ralph said carefully, "I have been watching what happens in this kingdom for 6 years, and I have seen a lot of people reach the edge of something important and get pushed back before they could say what they found. You're not the first person Donald has silenced this way, but you think I might be the last." He did not answer immediately, which was, Alma was beginning to understand its own kind of answer. "The first arena trial," Ralph said finally. "Your opponent will be larger, faster, and trained. What they will not be is patience. They're being sent to end this quickly and publicly. If you survive the first round, the narrative changes. The crowd changes. Donald's control of this story depends entirely on this being over before anyone in that hall has time to think about what they actually witnessed tonight." "You're going to help me train," Alma said. "I'm going to help you think," Ralph said. "The training I can offer in 3 days isn't going to make you a fighter. It's going to make it harder to predict. Those are different things." Alma looked at him for a long moment. "You have been watching me," she said, and it was not an accusation. "Yes," Ralph said. "For how long?" He considered this. Long enough to know that what they called weakness in that hall tonight was not weakness. It was something they don't have a name for because it hasn't shown up in their playbook. Alma exhaled slowly. "That is either the most useful thing anyone has said to me in years," she said, "or the beginning of a very elaborate trap." "It's both," Ralph said, with the faintest suggestion of something that might, in a different setting, have been a smile. "But right now, it's mostly the useful thing." And there, it was the beginning of the most unlikely alliance in Ashenvale's history. Not a dramatic moment, not a declaration, just two people in a cold stone room, one of them holding a document that proved the system was corrupt and the other standing in that room anyway, past the point where it was safe to be there. That night, Ralph brought bread and a worn training map. Alma set aside the bread and unfolded the map. "Show me the arena layout," she said. Ralph looked at her. Then he sat down across from her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched in the narrow space, and he began to talk. Outside, the kingdom of Ashenvale went about its evening. Soldiers drank in taverns. Council members filed papers. Troy made a joke at a dinner party about the look on Alma's face, and people laughed because they were supposed to. Nobody noticed what was being built in the holding chamber. Nobody except Donald, who woke twice that night from a sleep he could not explain losing, with the particular unease of a man whose instincts are wiser than his certainty. Lesson: the most powerful partnerships are not the loudest ones. Some of history's most important movements were built in quiet rooms, between people who chose truth over safety. If you have ever had someone stand with you when it cost them something, you know exactly what this moment means. The arena of Ashenvale was a circle of sand and stone 40 meters across, open to the sky, ringed by tiered stone seating that on trial days filled from the outer edges inward servants in the highest rows, merchants in the middle, lords and council members in the lowest, closest tiers, near enough to smell the sand and hear the impact. The morning of the first trial was cold and clear. The sky was the pale white blue of early spring, and the light it gave was flat and honest, the kind that shows everything without mercy. Alma stood at the arena's western entrance gate and did not let herself look at the crowd yet. She looked at the sand, at the patterns the wind was making on its surface, the small, constant shifts that told you which direction the air was moving, where the ground would be softest, where the footing was most likely to be unreliable. Ralph had taught her to read a space before she entered it. Not to look for threats immediately. To look for the room itself. First, what it was built to do, what it favored, what it hid. She wore the same violet gown. This had been a deliberate choice. She had been offered arena clothing rough-spun gray, practical, anonymous. She had declined. If Donald wanted to perform her weakness for the kingdom, she was going to be recognizable doing it. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd when she walked out into the arena. Not cheering, not yet, but the particular sound of thousands of people recalibrating expectations. They had expected gray. They had expected hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. They had expected a woman who already looked defeated. She walked to the center of the sand with her head level and her eyes open. Her opponent was named Garrett, a soldier from the eastern garrison who stood a full foot taller than her and had forearms that looked like architecture. He wore light arena armor, carried a short sparring sword, and had the easy, settled posture of someone who has won this kind of fight before and is not especially worried about today. He looked at Alma, and his expression did something she recognized. It softened, not into kindness, into the particular carelessness that comes from not taking something seriously. Good, she thought. Stay exactly like that. Brad announced the rules from the judge's platform with the theatrical solemnity of someone who has made boredom into performance. First contact, point wins the round. 3 rounds. Incapacitation ends the match. The signal dropped. Garrett moved toward her at a confident, measured pace. The approach of a man who sees no reason to rush because he does not believe she can reach him before he reaches her. He was right about that. She had no intention of reaching him. Alma moved left. Not a fighting move. Not a dodge. Just a repositioning 3 steps, fluid and unhurried, that put the afternoon sun directly over her left shoulder and squarely in Garrett's eyes. He adjusted. She moved right. He adjusted again. She moved back left, and, as he turned to follow, she stepped inside his reach, not attacking, just there suddenly, inside the radius where a long-armed fighter has the least leverage, and placed one open hand against the center of his chest plate, cleanly. Contact point. Round 1. The crowd went silent. Brad blinked, counted, called the point. The silence lasted 3 full seconds before it broke into something impossible to categorize. Not applause, not booing, but the raw, confused sound of an audience that has just witnessed something it did not have a category for. Up in the council tier, Troy had stopped smiling. Sandra uncrossed her arms. Donald's expression did not change, but his grip on the staff across his knees shifted the smallest tightening, barely visible, the kind you only notice if you're already watching for it. Ralph, standing at the arena's edge where the guards had not thought to stop him because he moved through spaces with an authority that made people assume he was supposed to be there, exhaled through his nose. Second round. Garrett was no longer careless. He came faster, with purpose, and he came directly as a man adjusting to a revised assessment. He was good. He was genuinely good. He had fast hands and good footwork, and he understood distance. And for the first 40 seconds of round 2, he pushed Alma backward across the full width of the arena. The crowd was with him. They had recovered from the surprise of round 1 and found a more comfortable story. She had gotten lucky. He was being careful now. It would end correctly. What they did not see because they were watching Garrett was that Alma was reading him. Every advance, every step, every weight transfer. She had spent 3 days with Ralph learning not how to fight, but how fighters think, what patterns they return to under pressure, what adjustments they make when a plan stops working. She had 3 days of data and 1 observation. Garrett planted his right foot slightly before every major strike. Not much, just enough. She waited. Right foot planted. She dropped low and moved inside the strike's arc, and he adjusted, and she adjusted to the adjustment, and his strike went wide, and she came up behind his extended arm and touched 2 fingers to the back of his shoulder. Contact. Round 2. The crowd erupted. Not for Alma specifically, for the story. Because now the story has changed, and human beings are magnificently, predictably loyal to a story once it starts moving in an unexpected direction. They had come for a quiet ending. They were getting something else. Third round. This is where it got complicated. Garrett was angry now, not blindly, but the controlled anger of a professional who has had his professional competence publicly questioned, and that was a different and more dangerous animal than carelessness. He fought the third round without patterns. Unpredictable, varied, relentless. Alma took a hit, not incapacitating, a glancing blow to her left shoulder that sent a bolt of hot pain down her arm and put her down on one knee in the sand. The crowd gasped. Brad leaned forward. Donald, in the council tier, sat slightly straighter. Here it is, his posture said. Here is the ending I prepared. Alma knelt in the sand for exactly 3 seconds. She put her palm flat against the ground. She felt the sand. She felt the weight of the air. She felt something else, not physical, not quite, but present, like a sound just below hearing, like warmth in a cold room. Something that had been waiting inside her since long before this arena, long before this tribunal, long before anyone in this kingdom had ever decided to look at her and see only what she was not. She stood up. She was breathing differently. Garrett came forward for the finishing point, and she moved not the calculated steps of the first 2 rounds, but something instinctive, fluid, moving the way water moves, following the path of least resistance, not out of weakness, but out of perfect efficiency. She found the gap in his approach without looking for it. She was simply there, inside it, and her hand touched his chest again at the exact center, over his heart. Round 3. Match. The noise that went up from the crowd was the loudest sound the arena had produced all morning. Alma stood in the center of the sand and breathed, and the light that was falling on her from the open sky seemed, to several people in the upper tiers who would later struggle to describe it accurately, slightly different than it should have been. Brighter, maybe, or warmer, or carrying a quality that the light in Ashenvale did not usually carry. Something had shifted, not just in the arena. Donald was standing. His face was controlled. But anyone who had spent long enough watching powerful men lose their certainty would have recognized the exact quality of the stillness he was now performing. Troy was no longer at ease. For the first time in years, Troy was thinking. Sandra's Sandra, who never shifted, who never broke posture, who had been the most composed person in every room she had occupied for 15 years. Sandra was watching Alma walk off the sand, and there was something in Sandra's expression that she herself could not have named yet. It was the beginning of doubt. Lesson: intelligence, preparation, and patience are not lesser weapons. They are superior ones. In every arena, boardrooms, courtrooms, life itself, the person who has done the real work before the moment arrives is always the one who surprises everyone when it matters. Alma did not get lucky. She got ready. The morning after the first trial, Ashenvale's capital woke up and talked about nothing else. Not because the people were suddenly revolutionaries. Not because one arena match had transformed a kingdom's values overnight. Human systems don't break that cleanly. What had happened was subtler and, in the long run, more powerful. A story had changed direction, and once a story changes direction in public, it is very difficult to change it back. The outer districts, the neighborhoods Alma had served with her aid networks, the people whose names Donald had summarized as unproductive in a tribunal document, those people were loud and immediate. They had always known what Alma was. Now, they had 40 minutes of arena footage to show anyone who hadn't been paying attention. The merchant class, always the most precise readers of which way the wind was blowing, began hedging. Quiet conversations over breakfast tables. Adjustments to public statements. The particular diplomatic maneuver of people who have been on the wrong side of something and have begun calculating the cost of staying there. Troy, meanwhile, had a spectacular political disaster at a council dinner that evening. It was not planned. It was the kind of disaster that happens when a person who has built their entire identity on being the smartest person in the room suddenly finds the room full of people who no longer agree. He had made a casual, dismissive remark, the kind of remark he had been making about Alma for months without consequence, and a council junior member named Davis, who had been quiet and unremarkable for 3 years, had simply said, "Do you know how much she saved the outer district supply routes? Did you look at the numbers?" Troy had laughed. Davis had produced a document. The table had gone quiet. Troy's laugh had continued 2 beats past the point where it was appropriate, and then died in an empty room. He had looked around and found that the expressions of the people who had been his audience were no longer the expressions of an audience. They were the expressions of people doing math. He had recovered, of course. He was a politician. But the recovery had been visible and visible recovery, for a man whose currency was effortless confidence, was a debt he did not know how to repay. The documents Davis had produced were Alma's original aid network records. The numbers they contained were not emotional. They were precise, clean, and deeply inconvenient. Over 2 years, Alma's unauthorized citizen networks had actually saved the kingdom's outer district a documented sum in emergency resource allocation that dwarfed the cost of running the networks themselves. She had been doing, informally and without credit, something the council's official agencies have been failing to do efficiently for a decade. The question of where those documents had come from was not answered that evening. It would be answered later. But if you had followed the chain, you would have found it led back through 3 intermediary hands to a set of armor that was muted in color and belonged to a man named Ralph. Ralph, who had spent 6 years moving through the kingdom's institutions quietly enough that nobody had thought to monitor him carefully. Ralph, who had access to documentation that he had been collecting and protecting and waiting to use. Ralph, who had decided 6 years ago that the right moment would come, and who had recognized that moment the instant he had seen Alma standing in the cathedral hall with her chin at exactly 1 inch of lift and her expression saying something impossible to ignore. The holding chambers had a small practice yard connected to them technically for use by guards, practically unused because the guards had better facilities elsewhere. Alma had claimed it after the first trial. Ralph came every evening. The second trial was 5 days away. The third was 10 days after that. Alma did not know yet who her opponents would be, but Ralph had a theory about the second that he shared while they worked through movement patterns in the dim evening light. "Donald is going to escalate," Ralph said. watching her move through a balanced sequence. Round 1 was a test. He expected you to fail publicly. You didn't. Round 2, he's going to send someone who can't be beaten by patience alone. Brad himself? Alma asked. Not yet. Brad is the finale. The third trial. He's saving that. Round 2 will be someone with speed, someone who removes the time advantage, someone who doesn't give you the opportunity to read them. Then I learned to read faster, Alma said. Where you stop reading and start leading, Ralph said. There's a difference. Reading is reactive. Leading means you're making them respond to you. Alma stopped. She turned to look at him. Is this where you tell me to stop thinking like someone trying to survive and start thinking like someone trying to win? It's where I ask if there's a difference, Ralph said. She considered this. Not anymore, she said. Not since round 1. Ralph was quiet for a moment. The practice yard was lit by 2 smoking torches that threw warm, uneven light. Alma's dark hair was loose, and there was sand still caught in the sleeve of her gown from the morning, and she looked nothing like the polished, composed woman who had walked into the tribunal. She looked more like herself. Ralph, who had been watching from a careful distance for 6 years, found this significantly harder to manage than he had anticipated. You should eat something, he said, before we go again. You keep feeding me, Alma observed. It's beginning to seem like a pattern. It's called a supply chain, Ralph said. A concept I believe you have some experience with. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since the tribunal, and it surprised both of them. Bright and genuine, the kind of sound that happens when your body decides to refuse the gravity of a situation for exactly 1 moment. Ralph turned away to the supply bag with the specific efficiency of a man, ensuring his expression is not on display. Ralph almost said, why did you start watching me? 6 years ago. What was it? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, you were arguing with a supply officer in the East Market about the distribution schedules for the Outer District winter allocations. You had numbers. You had a counter-proposal. You had sources. The supply officer had seniority and volume. He was twice your size and 3 times as loud, and he talked over every single point you made. I remember that, Alma said. When he walked away, you wrote everything down, Ralph said. Not for him. Not for anyone watching. You just wrote it down. And then you went and found the next person who could help with the problem. That is not a remarkable story, Alma said. No, Ralph said. That's why I kept watching. I've watched a lot of people lose an argument to someone with more authority and then give up or get angry or spend their energy resenting the loss. You just moved on to the next angle. Like losing one conversation was data, not defeat. Alma was quiet. I never thought that was unusual, she said finally. That, Ralph said, turning back to her and handing her a piece of bread with the no-ceremony practicality of someone trying very hard not to make this a moment, is the most interesting thing about you. They sat in the practice yard and ate in the kind of quiet that does not require filling, while in the council hall 200 meters above them, political reality was slowly rearranging itself in ways that neither Donald nor Troy had the humility to yet fully understand. Lesson: persistent, documented, solution-focused people are the actual engines of every meaningful reform in history. They're not the loudest voices. They're the ones who kept showing up after the room went quiet. Alma's 6-year record of service was the infrastructure of her defense, built long before she needed it. The lesson: always do the right thing. The record always matters. The second arena trial came on a morning when the capital's weather had turned overcast and sharp, a cold wind coming off the northern mountains that made the arena sand-dark and dense. The crowd was larger than the first day. They had come from outer districts and merchant quarters and quietly, without announcing themselves from the noble estates, where people who had attended the first trial had told their households about it in the particular tones of people describing something they had no vocabulary for. Donald had sent a fighter named Miles, lean and devastatingly fast, a specialist in short-burst explosive speed who had a record in arena trials that went undefeated for 4 years. Miles was exactly what Ralph had predicted, someone designed to remove time from the equation. The match lasted 14 minutes. Alma lost the first round, cleanly, undeniably, without anything available to her to prevent it, Miles, was simply faster in the opening 40 seconds than any adjustment she had time to make. She felt the contact on her shoulder and heard the call and straightened and filed it away. Round 2. She changed her approach completely. Instead of positioning and reading, she moved unpredictably, not with speed to match Miles, but with a rhythm that refused to be anticipated, starting movements and abandoning them, changing direction mid-step, creating the particular difficulty of an opponent who cannot be timed. Miles was extraordinary against a predictable opponent, against one who had decoupled their body from their apparent intention. He had to slow his own assessment, and in that slowing, Alma found 2 contact points in 3 minutes. Round 2, Alma. Round 3 was the loudest arena crowd Ashenvale had seen in living memory. They were on their feet, not for Miles, not for the system, but for the strange magnetic pull of watching someone fight a battle that had stopped being about physical contact and started being about something people in that crowd recognized from their own lives, the feeling of being outmatched by someone with more power, more speed, more institutional support, and choosing to keep going anyway. Alma won round 3 on a single, precise moment. Miles overcommit to a left-side advance, and she stepped right and placed her hand on his chest from behind his extended arm, and it was over. She was beginning to understand what the warmth was. It had been there in the first trial, brief and barely legible. Now it was clearer when she stopped thinking and started moving from something deeper, something that felt less like strategy and more like recognition. Like her body knew something her conscious mind was still catching up to. Like there was a layer of her that had been quietly operational her entire life, patient and waiting, that was beginning to respond to the pressure she was under the way a seed responds to the right combination of heat and water. It frightened her a little, not because it felt wrong, because it felt more right than anything she had ever experienced, and she had no name for it, and she had spent her whole life in a kingdom that feared what it could not name. That evening, she told Ralph. It's not a technique, she said. They were in the practice yard, sitting on a low stone wall, and the torches were burning lower than usual because Ralph had forgotten to check them. It's not anything I learned. It's more like remembering something I didn't know I had stored. Ralph was quiet for a longer moment than usual. Tell me about your family, he said. She frowned. My parents were a healer and a teacher. I told you. And before that, your family name, Caldwell. Do you know its full history? My parents weren't interested in lineage, Alma said. They thought it was. She paused. My mother used to say that people who spend all their time talking about who they came from are usually avoiding the question of who they're choosing to be. She sounds remarkable, Ralph said. She was. Alma said. The Caldwell line, Ralph said carefully, in the archive records that predate the current council, and I mean the original founding records, not the edited versions in the public library, the Caldwell line is listed as one of the 4 guardian bloodlines of the kingdom. Before Donald's predecessors rewrote the succession protocols 2 generations ago, the guardian bloodlines were the arbiters of balance between the throne and the people. They weren't rulers. They were the words used as stewards. Alma was completely still. And the thing about guardian bloodlines, Ralph continued, his voice level, is that they weren't defined by physical strength. They were defined by something the original founders called resonance, a capacity for connection between a person's own will and the living energy of the kingdom itself. It was tied, in the original texts, to a specific manifestation. What kind of manifestation? Alma asked. Ralph looked at her steadily. The old records describe it as a wolf spirit. White, made of light, bound to the soul of the guardian, not the body. The practice yard was very quiet. The torches guttered in the wind. Donald knew, Alma said. It was not a question. Donald's family has known about the guardian bloodlines for 2 generations, Ralph said. They've spent 2 generations ensuring those records were inaccessible. Those bloodlines were either absorbed or discredited, and anyone who showed signs of resonance was managed. Your parents weren't harassed by the council arbitrarily. Their careers were specifically limited. And when you started building infrastructure in the outer districts that was demonstrably more effective than the council systems, it wasn't your defiance that frightened Donald. It was the pattern, Alma said slowly. A guardian's pattern. Someone oriented toward the health of the whole, not the dominance of the top. He couldn't let you finish what you were building, Ralph said. Not because you were weak, because you weren't. Alma sat with this. Let it move through her in layers. Then she looked at Ralph with an expression that was not the calm she usually wore. It was something more complex, more interior, and quieter. You've known for a while, she said. Since I found the original archive records 2 years ago, he said. Yes. And you've been? Watching, he said simply, and keeping those records somewhere they couldn't be destroyed. And a pause. Hoping you'd get here intact. The space between them had been narrowing in the past week in the way that distance between two people narrows when they are not discussing it. Ralph's shoulder was close to hers on the wall. The bad torchlight was doing its best. Ralph, she said. Don't, he said, not unkindly. I haven't said anything. I know. I'm working up to hearing it. She turned to look at him directly, and he turned to look at her, and for a moment the practice yard held its breath. Whatever this is, Alma said carefully, I need you to know it is not something I am saying because I am afraid and you are the only person here. I know, Ralph said. He said it like someone who has carried something for a long time and is only just now putting it down. He did not move closer. He was not a man who rushed things. But his hand, resting on the wall between them, moved exactly 1 inch toward hers. It was enough. The third trial Brad was 6 days away. In the council chambers that same night, something else was unfolding. Sandra had requested a private meeting. Not with Donald. Not with Troy. With the 3 council clerks responsible for maintaining the kingdom's resource allocation records. Sandra was not a sentimental person. She had never been. She had built a political career on the understanding that sentiment was a liability and precision was an asset, and she had operated accordingly. She had seconded every motion against Alma in the tribunal. She had enforced every social humiliation the system had placed on the women in her sphere who showed the wrong kinds of strength in the wrong kinds of rooms. She had also, privately, spent 15 years watching those choices accumulate and wondering in the specific locked-away way of people who cannot afford to wonder out loud what she had actually built. The documents Davis had produced at Troy's dinner, the ones that traced back to Ralph, had included a second file. Not Alma's aid records. Sandra's own. A private record of every resource Sandra had redirected, every voice she had helped silence, every woman who had been removed from a position of influence in the past decade, and what had happened to those women afterward. The document was not accusatory in tone. It was simply chronological, factual, the kind of document that requires no commentary, because the sequence itself says everything. Sandra had read it 3 times that afternoon. Then she called a meeting with the clerks. I need, she said, in the precise, controlled voice she used for everything, the complete current state of the outer district emergency allocations. All of them. And I need to know, specifically, where those allocations have been rerouted in the past 18 months and who authorized each rerouting. The clerks exchanged a glance. Then they began to pull the documents. Sandra already knew what she was going to find. She was simply choosing, finally, to look at it. She was thinking about Alma in the arena. She was thinking about the look on Alma's face when she won round 3, not triumphant, not vindicated, just present. The look of someone who had always known the truth about themselves and had simply been waiting for a room to finally see it. Sandra had worked very hard for a very long time to avoid ever having a moment like this. She was having it anyway. Lesson. Complicity in systems of harm never insulates a person from the system's eventual accounting. Sandra's story is the story of every person who has participated in unfair structures because it seemed safe, profitable, or simply easier than resistance. The moment of reckoning comes. The only question is whether it arrives as an external collision or an internal one. The morning of the third trial arrived the way significant mornings always do, with the unremarkable, infuriating normalcy of light coming through a window at the same angle it always does, birds making the same sounds they always make, the city going about its early preparation as though nothing were different. But everything was different. The arena was beyond capacity. They had opened the outer walls to accommodate the overflow of people standing in the streets around the arena's perimeter, merchants who had abandoned their morning trade, Children in school clothes who had apparently made a collective decision that history was more important than attendance. The seating inside held every council member, every noble, every ranking soldier. Even the people who had voted for Alma's exile. Especially them. They had come because they needed to see how it ended. Donald was on the throne again, elevated, visible, flanked by his personal guard. He had said nothing publicly about the past two trials. His political management of the situation had been to say nothing, do nothing publicly visible, and wait for Brad to resolve it. Brad had never failed to resolve anything in 10 years. Brad appeared from the arena's eastern gate to the specific wave of anticipation that 10 years of reputation creates. He was massive, not overbuilt, but genuinely, functionally large, the kind of size that comes from decades of real use. His armor was dark and heavy, and he moved in it the way people move, in clothing they have worn long enough to forget they have it on. His sword was already drawn. He did not do warm-up rituals. He did not acknowledge the crowd. He walked to the center of the sand, turned, and waited. When Alma entered from the western gate, the crowd sound was enormous and layered, part of it energy, part of it anxiety, part of it that particular collective emotion that doesn't have a single name, but that you recognize the moment a room full of people has decided, all at once, that they're watching something that matters. She was still in the violet gown. It was more worn now, the hem marked by sand and yews, the fabric pulled slightly at the shoulder where she had taken the hit in round one, 2 weeks of something other than its original ceremonial intention behind it. She was beautiful and tired and completely, deliberately present. Ralph was at the arena's edge. He caught her eye as she passed the gate, a single, direct look that contained everything they had built in the practice yard over the past 2 weeks. She held it for exactly 1 second. Then she walked into the sand. Brad watched her come. His expression was the same as it had been at the tribunal, professionally bored. But there was something at its edge, now not respect, not yet, but the functional attentiveness of a man who has seen the previous 2 rounds and is not making the mistake of the people who came before him. "You survived longer than I expected," Brad said. He said it without cruelty, simply as observation. "I expected it," Alma said. Brad looked at her for a moment. Then the signal dropped, and he moved. He was everything the first 2 opponents were not combined. Fast and heavy and patient and unpredictable. He did not come at her immediately. He circled, assessing, giving her nothing to read. She understood quickly, a completely different category of problem. First contact came 40 seconds in. Brad's hand on her shoulder, not a hit, a hold, and she went down to her knees in the sand. Clean, fast, completely overwhelming. Round 1 to Brad. The crowd was quiet, with the specific quiet of people watching something painful that they cannot look away from. Donald sat forward slightly. Alma stood from the sand, and the warmth was back stronger now, insistent, no longer waiting at the edges of her attention. Something in her had stopped arguing with it. She looked at Brad, and instead of strategy, she felt direction, clear, wordless, physical direction, the way you feel which way is north without having to calculate it. Round 2. She moved differently, not more carefully, more completely. Every step fully committed to, every change of direction total rather than cautious. Brad adjusted to each adjustment, and she absorbed the adjustment and moved again. It became clear to the crowd slowly, and then all at once, that something had changed in the past 30 seconds, something they could see but not articulate. The woman in the violet gown was no longer a person surviving a stronger opponent. She was moving with something that was moving with her. The air in the arena went slightly different, warmer, brighter. Not dramatically, not a special effect, not a production. Just a quality shift that several hundred people in the crowd noticed simultaneously and could not account for. Brad noticed it too. He pressed harder. He came at her with the specific force of a man trying to end something before it becomes something he doesn't understand. And Alma met his advance and stepped inside it and placed her hand against his chest, and it was not just contact this time. The light that had been gathering around her moved. It was not an explosion. It was not theatrical. It was the particular, undeniable quality of something true becoming visible the way a thing has been real all along, and suddenly the conditions are right for it to be seen. The wolf emerged from the light behind her. It was enormous, not threatening, enormously the way ancient, significant things are enormous. Not aggressive, but simply beyond the scale of ordinary. It was white and radiant, made of light that had substance, and it stood behind Alma with its shoulder at her height, and its eyes pale silver, warm, ancient, moving across the arena with the calm of something that has been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. The crowd made a sound that had no name. Brad stepped back. Not in fear, Brad was not. In the end, a fearful man, but in the instinctive physical response to being in the presence of something categorically beyond what you had prepared for. The wolf did not move toward anyone. It simply stood, and in its standing, something in the arena shifted permanently. The hierarchy that had governed Ashenvale for generations, strength as dominance, power as control, worth as capacity for violence, met something older and more foundational than itself, and felt for the first time its own limits. Donald was standing. His staff was in his hand, and his knuckles were white, and his face was the face of a man whose entire structure of control has just developed a crack that goes all the way through. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice was still controlled. "This is some arrangement, some deception." "The records disagree," said Sandra. Every head in the council tier turned. Sandra stood from her seat. She held, in both hands, a bound set of documents, thick, old, the pages at the edges dark with age. The original founding records. The original Guardian bloodline archives. The records that Donald's family had spent 2 generations removing from every accessible collection. Ralph had given them to her 3 days ago. She had spent 3 days reading them. "The Caldwell Guardian line," Sandra said, her voice as precise as it always was, but carrying something it had never carried before, the specific authority of someone who has chosen, at cost to themselves, to tell the truth, is documented in the founding charter of this kingdom. Its powers are documented. Its purpose is documented. What is also documented, she held the records higher, is that the suppression of Guardian bloodlines constitutes, in the founding law that this council has never actually repealed, because repealing it would require admitting it exists, treason against the kingdom's foundational compact. The council tier went absolutely still. Troy got the color of old plaster. Donald's staff hit the stone platform, and the sound rang across the arena like a bell. "You are going to regret." "Donald." The voice came from the lower tiers, then from the middle, then from the upper sections and the standing crowds beyond the walls. Not a word, just his name, spoken by hundreds of people at once, in the particular flat, unadorned tone that power recognizes as the thing it has always been trying to prevent. The moment when the people it has governed stop being governed by it. Brad looked at Donald. He looked at Alma and the wolf of light behind her. He looked at the crowd. Then he put his sword back in its scabbard, turned, and walked out of the arena. It was the most decisive thing Brad had ever done. The wolf remained a moment longer. It turned its ancient, silver gaze toward Alma. She looked back at it without fear, with the recognition of someone meeting a part of themselves they did not know was missing. Then it was light. Then it was warm. Then it was gone back into her, and Alma stood alone in the sand, and she was different than she had been when she walked in. Not because the wolf had changed her, because it had always been her. Lesson: true power does not need to destroy to prove itself. It does not need an audience to be real. History's most lasting leaders, from Mandela to Tubman to every unsung community builder who held their ground when it cost them, demonstrated that the kind of strength which endures is not the kind that dominates. It is the kind that holds. The accounting began before the sand had fully settled. It was not a dramatic overthrow. It was not a battle, not a coup, not a moment of theatrical revolution. Real systemic change, the kind that lasts, rarely is. What was a reckoning steady, documented, and conducted through the same legal structures Donald had used to exile Alma, because Alma understood something Donald had never grasped. You do not build a better world by burning the old one's foundations. You build it by replacing what is corrupt with what is sound, and you use every available tool to do it properly. The founding charter Sandra had produced was authenticated within 24 hours by 3 independent scholars who had spent years wondering why they had never been permitted access to those specific archives. The provisions it contained were clear. The Guardian Compact was not a legend. It was the law. It had simply been buried. Donald was removed from the throne not by force, but by a formal council motion. The first unanimous motion the council had passed in 11 years, citing violations of the founding charter across a documented list of 67 specific instances spanning 15 years of his governance. Every redirected allocation, every suppressed bloodline record, every political exile engineered through manufactured verdicts, including Alma's. He did not speak at the hearing. He sat in the chair they had placed for him in the center of the very same cathedral hall where he had sentenced Alma, and he looked at the council members who had been his allies, reading his own record of actions back to him in the flat, procedural voices of people who have understood, finally, the cost of their participation, and he said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, because for the first time in his political life, the room had stopped performing his script, and he had no improvisation. That silence, in the end, was the most honest thing Donald had ever offered the kingdom. He was removed from all titles and properties and remanded to house arrest, pending the completion of the financial investigations that Alma's aid network records, cross-referenced with 15 years of Treasury documents, had made possible. The investigations would take months. The charges that emerged from them were significant. Donald spent the following years in a very quiet house with a great deal of time to think about the specific cost of choosing greed and fear over governance. Troy's political career ended in the council chamber where Davis had produced the documents. It did not end with a ceremony. It ended with the particular ignoble deflation of public exposure. Troy, who had built himself entirely on the currency of being in the winning room, found that when the winning room changed composition, he had nothing underneath the currency. No actual governance record. No policy achievements of substance. No relationships built on anything except convenience. He resigned before he was removed, which was the last political calculation he ever made, and he spent the subsequent years in the kind of comfortable obscurity that is worse than visible failure, because there is no stage and no audience and no performance to hide behind. Brad, to the surprise of nearly everyone, became the most straightforward part of the resolution. He had spent 10 years executing Donald's arena agenda, and he knew it, and he said so, without drama or excuse, in the formal inquiry that followed. He cooperated completely. He provided names and dates and specifics. He asked for nothing in return. When the inquiry panel asked him why, he said, "Because I was paid to win fights. I was not paid to lie about what I knew." It was, all things considered, a more principled statement than anyone had expected from him. He was given a reduced accountability sentence and assigned to the outer district training programs, where he turned out to be, improbably, an excellent teacher. Sandra's case was the most complex. She had been complicit. She had not been the architect. The distinction mattered and also did not fully absolve her. And she was the first person to say, so standing before the Accountability Council in the same cathedral hall, in the same precise voice she always used, and saying, "I enforced a system that I knew was unjust because it was professionally advantageous to do so. The documents I provided do not cancel that history. They are simply the first accurate thing I have offered this council in 15 years, and I offer them as the beginning of an accounting, not the end of one." The accountability panel deliberated for 3 days. Their ruling was measured. Sandra would step back from executive power for a period of 3 years, during which she would serve as an advisor to the outer district reconstruction initiatives, specifically the formal and funded version of the aid networks she had helped suppress. She would be paid a civil servant salary and would receive no political titles. After 3 years, her standing would be reassessed. Sandra accepted the ruling without comment. She showed up to the outer district office the following Monday, wearing a plain coat, carrying a document case, and knowing exactly what needed to be fixed because she had been the person helping break it for 15 years. She was, in some respects, the most useful person in the room. The coronation was held in the cathedral hall on a morning when the spring had fully arrived, warm light through the tall windows, the stone floor the same pale granite it had always been. the carved kings on the pillars watching with the same permanent silence. The seats were filled again, the same hall, the same capacity, but the composition of who stood where was different now. The outer district delegations were in the front tiers. The council members who had voted for Alma's exile were in the outer rings. Alma stood in the center of the hall, where she had stood 8 weeks before, and she wore a gown that was a deeper, richer violet than the trial gown, the same color, the same essence, but made now with the full resources of a kingdom that was choosing, for the first time in a very long time, to be something other than afraid of itself. Her dark hair was down. Her expression was the same as it had been in the tribunal, not triumphant, not vindicated, present, fully, entirely present. The council elder who performed the coronation read the founding charter passage aloud, the Guardian Compact, in full, for the first time in public in 2 generations. The words were old and formal and clear. The Guardian of Ashenvale holds not dominion over the people, but covenant with them. Their strength is not drawn from the throne, but from the truth it represents. They lead not by command, but by example, not by fear, but by the force of a life lived in alignment with the kingdom's deepest good. Alma knelt for the crown and rose. The sound that went up from the hall was not the performance applause of a crowd that has been given its cue. It was the unmanaged, layered, genuine sound of a room full of people who have just participated in something true. Ralph was in the hall. He was not in the ceremonial position or the formal arrangement. He was standing to the side, in the same muted armor, in the same slightly apart position he always occupied. He had not planned to be emotional about it. He was emotional about it. When the ceremony ended and the hall began to shift into the quieter movement of people processing and departing, Alma came to where Ralph was standing. She stood in front of him, and the crown caught the morning light. "You planned this from the beginning," she said. "I planned for it to be possible," he said. "You made it actually. That is a meaningful distinction, and I am going to let you have it," she said, and the slight curve of her mouth was the least formal expression she had allowed herself in 8 weeks. "There's a lot to build," Ralph said. "The reform proposals alone, Ralph, are going to take at least 2 years to fully implement, and the Treasury investigations. Ralph." He stopped. I looked at her. "We could do all of that," she said. "We will do all of that." But right now, for exactly this one moment, she reached out and covered his hand with hers, and it was not a ceremonial gesture, not a performance for the room, just 2 people in the specific warmth of a morning that had cost them a great deal and given them everything. "Can you stop planning?" Ralph looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." His hand turned over and held hers. Outside, the kingdom of Ashenvale went about its morning. The spring light was warm on the cathedral stone face. In the outer districts, people were reading the posted announcements about the new reconstruction initiatives and the restored aid network charters and the first session of the Reform Council that would include citizen representatives for the first time in Ashenvale's history. Children were going to school. Markets were opening. Supply routes were being mapped by people who understood distribution and care and the economics of keeping a community functional rather than compliant. The wolf slept lightly somewhere in Alma's chest, and it was warm, and it was hers, and it was exactly what it had always been. Not a weapon. A truth. And that finally was enough. "Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now?" Because if Alma's journey did something to you, if something in this story found a place inside you that needed to hear it, then you already know this is not just a story. It is a reminder that the person they're most afraid of is never the loudest one in the room. It is the one who knows the truth and refuses to stop moving toward it. If this story added something to your day, your week, or your perspective, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your presence here is not small. Every comment, every subscription is how this community grows and how stories like this one reach someone who may need it even more than you did. We want to say hello to you personally. Drop your location below. We will find you. We will say it. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Here is what Ashenvale learned and what we hope you take with you. Systems that define strength only by its ability to dominate are systems in permanent, inevitable decline. They produce leaders who can hold power but not build with it. They produce citizens who are compliant but not capable. They mistake fear for respect and control for safety, and they confuse the two until the confusion becomes the foundation, and foundations built on confusion do not stand. Alma was never weak. She was empathetic, which requires more courage than dominance. She was patient, which is harder than aggression. She was principled, which is more costly than compliance. She built things for other people without requiring credit, which is rarer than any arena skill and more powerful than any sword. The kingdom called these things weak because the kingdom was afraid of them, because a person who leads from genuine care cannot be controlled by a person who leads from fear, and those in power always know the difference between a subject and a threat. Alma was always the threat, and the wolf, the ancient, radiant, waiting wolf, was never a weapon given to her. It was the name of what she already was, finally spoken aloud in a language everyone could understand. Ralph stood beside her not because she needed rescue, but because he recognized her, and recognizing the act of truly seeing another person, of choosing to witness who they actually are rather than who is convenient for you to see, is one of the most powerful acts of love available to us. Donald fell not because he was defeated. He fell because he was wrong, and wrong things, when the people around them finally stop pretending, cannot hold their own weight. Troy lost not because anyone destroyed him, but because there was nothing underneath the performance. His lesson is the sharpest one. Talent for politics is not a substitute for substance, and rooms change composition faster than reputations built on air can adapt. Sandra chose, finally, to be honest, and honesty at cost is not the same as honesty that costs nothing. Her choice came late. It came anyway. The lesson is not that you must be perfect from the beginning. The lesson is that the moment you choose truthfully is always available to you, and the longer you wait, the more it costs, and the more it matters. Brad chose to stop being useful to the wrong side. Small choice. Enormous consequences. Some of history's most significant moments have been exactly that, a single person deciding that what they are serving no longer deserves their competence. Alma's reign began not with fanfare, but with work. Reform bills, citizen councils, outer district infrastructure budgets that reflected what was actually needed rather than what was politically comfortable. A treasury audit that took 14 months and produced accountability that was not pleasant for anyone involved. A council composition that included voices that had never before been in a council chamber. Slow, difficult, essential work. The kind of work that never looks as good as the coronation and matters far more. And Ralph, who had spent 6 years being a silent observer and 3 weeks being an active participant, adjusted to his new role with the specific difficulty and specific grace of a man learning to trust that the thing he had been waiting for was actually real now, and could hold his weight and would not disappear. It was real. It was held. He learned. And sometimes the ones they call weak are simply the ones they fear most.